Before the smoke cleared and before a nation could begin to heal, America was torn apart by its deadliest conflict, one that pitted brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and ideals against survival. The Civil War wasn't just a battle over territory, it was a war for the very soul of a nation. What caused such immense bloodshed between a people once united? What happened in the dark heart of America that led to a conflict so vast, so brutal, and so transformative that it would forever reshape the country's destiny? Today, you'll hear the complete, unfiltered story, rich with history, heartbreak, and humanity. From the roots of division to the fires of battle, and through the fragile peace that followed, we will walk together through the entire epic journey of the American Civil War. But before we begin this immersive experience, make sure to hit that like button if you're enjoying deep dive history content. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment below, let us know where you're listening from, and what historical topic you'd love us to cover next. We read every suggestion, and your feedback helps shape future stories. Now, take a breath, settle in, and let's journey back to the moment when the United States of America nearly ceased to be. Chapter 1: A House Divided. Long before the first shots echoed across Fort Sumter, the seeds of civil war had been sown into the very soil of the American Republic. From the moment the United States declared its independence, a fault line ran beneath its lofty ideals. On one hand, it proclaimed liberty and equality, but on the other, it tolerated, and in some states, depended upon, the institution of human slavery. That contradiction, while initially masked by compromise and political maneuvering, would eventually erupt into the most catastrophic conflict ever fought on American soil. The early 19th century was a period of rapid change and growing tension. As America expanded westward, fueled by the doctrine of manifest destiny, each new state that entered the Union sparked furious debate: would it be a free state or a slave state? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to balance the scales, drawing a line across the territories and declaring which lands could adopt slavery. But this was merely a temporary salve on a deepening wound. In the North, industrialization was transforming society. Cities swelled with factories, railroads, and immigrants, creating a culture increasingly hostile to the agrarian, slave-based economy of the South. The abolitionist movement gained traction, with figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and William Lloyd Garrison loudly condemning the inhumanity of slavery. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred the hearts of Northern readers, while Southern planters bristled at what they saw as Northern overreach and moral posturing. Meanwhile, the South clung tightly to its way of life. Cotton was king, and it ruled over an economic system rooted in the labor of enslaved Africans. To many Southern elites, the right to own slaves was not merely a cultural tradition, it was a cornerstone of their identity, their prosperity, and their very notion of liberty. Any threat to that system, even rhetorical, was seen as an existential attack. The Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state but strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, only deepened the divide. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty, led to a violent mini-civil war in Kansas itself, a foreshadowing of the blood to come. Then came the rise of a new political force, the Republican Party. Formed in the 1850s with a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery, it drew support from Northern industrialists, farmers, and abolitionists alike. Its rapid ascent alarmed the South. And in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln, a moderate Republican who promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but who opposed its spread, was elected president, the South erupted in fury. To many Southerners, Lincoln's victory was proof that they were now a permanent minority in a union increasingly hostile to their interests. Within weeks of the election, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Other Southern states quickly followed, forming the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis. They believed they were exercising the same right to self-government that had led the colonies to rebel against Britain. The Union, however, did not accept this interpretation. To Lincoln and many in the North, the United States was a single, indivisible nation. Secession was not a legitimate political action, it was rebellion. Tensions finally exploded in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Union garrison surrendered after a brief bombardment, and the war had begun. At first, both sides believed the conflict would be short. But they were tragically mistaken. Chapter 2, Into the Inferno, the First Battles and the Realization of a Long War. As the echoes of cannon fire faded from Fort Sumter's battered walls, the United States stood at a crossroads it had never faced before, an internal war between countrymen. President Abraham Lincoln, resolute but aware of the gravity of the situation, issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Across the North, young men flooded into recruitment offices, stirred by a mix of patriotism, idealism, and a belief that the conflict would be over in a matter of months. But this would be no brief rebellion. It would evolve into a long and bitter struggle, waged across vast landscapes and soaked in the blood of hundreds of thousands. The Confederate response to Lincoln's call for troops was swift and severe. The Upper South, which had been hesitant, now moved to join the secession. Virginia, with its immense population, industrial capacity, and prestige, became the crown jewel of the Confederacy. Its decision to secede in April 1861 was followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. With Richmond chosen as the Confederate capital, a symbolic and strategic reality emerged. The war would be fought not on distant frontiers but on the doorsteps of the very heart of America. The first major clash of arms came at a small creek in northern Virginia called Bull Run, near the town of Manassas. In July 1861, Union troops under General Irvin McDowell marched out from Washington, D.C. Confident that they would crush the Confederates and end the war before it truly began. Onlookers from Washington came with picnic baskets to watch the supposed spectacle. But they would witness horror instead. The First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as the South called it, was chaotic and bloody. Early Union successes were reversed when Confederate reinforcements, including the vaunted brigade under General Thomas J. Jackson, arrived and held firm. Jackson's fierce stand earned him the legendary nickname, Stonewall. As the Union lines broke and fled in panic back toward Washington, the illusion of a quick and easy victory evaporated. The war would be long, arduous, and far costlier than anyone had imagined. In the months that followed, both sides began to reckon with the scale of the conflict. The North, with its superior industrial base, railroads, and manpower, had immense potential power, but it also had to conquer a vast and hostile territory. The South, though outmatched in many ways, had the advantage of fighting defensively on familiar ground, with a passionate commitment to their cause and a culture that prized martial valor. President Lincoln, understanding the need for strong military leadership, turned to a series of generals in search of one who could bring victory. One early favorite was General George B. McClellan, a young, energetic officer who took command of the Army of the Potomac after Bull Run. He proved a brilliant organizer and trainer, transforming raw recruits into a disciplined force. Yet when the time came to fight, McClellan hesitated. His caution, bordering on paralysis, would soon test the patience of Lincoln and cost the Union dearly. While the East saw standoffs and limited action in late 1861, the Western Theater, the area stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, became a scene of vital Union advances. It was here that a previously little-known officer, Ulysses S. Grant, began to carve his name into history. In early 1862, Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, demanding unconditional surrender from the Confederate garrisons. These victories gave the Union control of key waterways and opened the door to deeper incursions into the South. But Grant's triumphs were tempered by the bloody Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. There, in southwestern Tennessee, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on Grant's camp, leading to 2 days of ferocious fighting. The carnage was unlike anything the nation had ever seen. Nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Though the Union ultimately held the field, Shiloh shattered illusions. The war had transformed into a grinding, brutal conflict of attrition. Naval warfare, too, began to reshape the conflict. The Union's strategy of blockading southern ports, part of the broader Anaconda Plan, sought to strangle the Confederacy economically by cutting off its trade with the outside world. Southern cotton exports dried up, and the South's ability to import weapons and supplies was severely hindered. Yet in one harbor, a revolution in naval technology unfolded. In March 1862, the Union ironclad USS Monitor fought the Confederate CSS Virginia. Itself built on the hull of the captured USS Merrimack, in the waters off Hampton Roads, Virginia. Their duel, though inconclusive, marked the end of the wooden warship era and heralded the dawn of iron-armored naval warfare. Meanwhile, political and diplomatic dimensions added further complexity. The Confederacy hoped for recognition and support from Britain and France, believing that Europe's reliance on Southern cotton would compel intervention. But while European powers watched with interest, they were wary. The Union's moral position, particularly regarding slavery, would become a crucial factor in keeping foreign nations at bay, a fact that Lincoln understood all too well. As 1862 progressed, the scale and intensity of the war deepened. New campaigns, new generals, and new strategies emerged. But so too did the human cost, which climbed higher with each passing month. By the end of that year, it was clear. The Civil War would be fought not just with armies, but with ideologies, economies, and the very soul of a nation at stake. Chapter 3, Antietam, Emancipation, and the Turning Tide. By the summer of 1862, the war was no longer a regional skirmish but a sprawling national trauma. The Confederate armies had proven themselves tenacious, and the Union, despite its advantages in men and industry, found itself struggling to strike a decisive blow. Morale fluctuated in both camps, and the political landscape grew more charged with each casualty report. President Abraham Lincoln, increasingly burdened by the weight of the conflict, began to see clearly that the war was not only a battle to preserve the Union, it was becoming a war to redefine it. In the East, General George McClellan finally made his long-awaited advance on Richmond, the Confederate capital. Known as the Peninsula Campaign, it was an ambitious attempt to approach Richmond from the southeast via the York and James rivers. McClellan's army was enormous and well-supplied, but he moved with exasperating slowness, convinced, incorrectly, that the Confederate forces outnumbered him. His hesitance gave General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, the time he needed to organize an aggressive defense. Robert E. Lee was unlike any other commander the Confederacy had seen. A Virginian who had turned down Lincoln's offer to lead the Union Army out of loyalty to his state, Lee brought audacity, intelligence, and a bold strategic mind to the Southern cause. In the 7 days battles, fought in late June and early July of 1862, Lee pushed back McClellan's forces and saved Richmond. It was a stunning series of engagements that turned the tide in the East and transformed Lee into the Confederacy's greatest hope. But Lee wasn't content to defend. By late summer, he launched an invasion of the North, crossing into Maryland with the goal of relieving pressure on Virginia, resupplying his army from Northern Territory, and possibly influencing foreign recognition of the Confederacy. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Antietam, fought near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, on September 17, 1862. Antietam was a clash of giants. Lee's 40,000 men faced off against McClellan's 75,000 in what would become the bloodiest single day in American history. From the sunken road later known as Bloody Lane to the cornfields mowed down by musket fire, the fighting was savage and relentless. By day's end, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle was strategically a Union victory, as Lee's invasion was halted and he was forced to retreat back into Virginia. For Lincoln, Antietam offered more than just a military moment, it provided a political opportunity. He had long been considering the idea of transforming the war into a moral crusade against slavery, but he needed a Union victory to avoid appearing desperate. With Antietam in hand, he made his move. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be, thenceforward, and forever free. While it did not immediately free a single enslaved person, the proclamation shifted the moral compass of the war. It transformed the Union cause from one of mere preservation into one of liberation. It also ensured that Britain and France, where slavery was broadly condemned, would not recognize the Confederacy. The South was incensed. The proclamation confirmed their worst fears about Lincoln and the North, that the war was, at its core, an assault on their entire way of life. The Confederacy responded with fury and hardened resolve. In the North, reactions were mixed. Abolitionists celebrated, but many soldiers and citizens who had enlisted to preserve the Union, not to free slaves, grumbled or protested. In places like New York City, anti-war and anti-black sentiment flared into open hostility. Yet Lincoln pressed forward. On January 1, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Black Americans, long denied agency in their own liberation, saw new hope. African American men were now allowed to enlist in the Union Army, and they responded with passion and courage. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts would later distinguish themselves on the battlefield, fighting not just for a country that had once enslaved them, but for the very promise of freedom itself. While the East had its drama, the Western theater saw more gains for the Union. General Grant, now a proven and rising star, continued to push southward, aiming for control of the Mississippi River. The river was the lifeline of the Confederacy, and Lincoln rightly believed that its capture would split the South in two. The key to that strategy lay in Vicksburg, a fortress city perched atop high bluffs overlooking the river. But the road to Vicksburg would be long and grueling. In the meantime, Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg attempted to strike into Kentucky, hoping to rally support in the border states. Their efforts culminated in the Battle of Perryville, which, though tactically a draw, ended with Confederate withdrawal and kept Kentucky firmly in Union hands. Back in the East, Lee was not finished. Buoyed by earlier successes and hoping to maintain momentum, he struck again, this time at Fredericksburg, Virginia. In December 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside launched a series of frontal assaults on Confederate positions entrenched on Marye's Heights. The result was a massacre. Wave after wave of Union soldiers were cut down by entrenched Confederate fire. Over 12,000 Union casualties marked a stunning defeat and deepened the despair in the North. As 1863 dawned, both sides were exhausted but unyielding. The Emancipation Proclamation had reshaped the ideological battlefield, adding a higher moral cause to the Union's mission. Yet military victory remained elusive, and both governments were now locked in a contest that was as much about political survival as it was about military strategy. The nation stood at a crossroads, weary but resolute. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 4: Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the war's turning point. The year 1863 began in darkness for the Union. Military blunders, mounting casualties, and flagging morale in the North cast long shadows over Washington. Political pressure bore down on President Lincoln from every direction. Some in his cabinet feared that the war was unwinnable, others insisted that emancipation had overreached and alienated loyal border states. Anti-war sentiment simmered in cities, and enlistment slowed as the grim realities of war reached every household. And yet, Lincoln remained firm. "We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth," he had declared. The tide, while still uncertain, was beginning to shift, and 1863 would prove to be the year that reshaped the fate of the nation. In the Eastern Theater, Robert E. Lee remained on the offensive. After his stunning victory at Fredericksburg, he struck again in the spring at Chancellorsville, facing Union General Joseph Hooker. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Lee employed a daring and risky plan, dividing his forces in the face of the enemy. His trusted lieutenant, General Stonewall Jackson, led a devastating flanking maneuver that shattered the Union right. Hooker, despite his superior numbers and defensive position, crumbled under the pressure of Lee's audacity. Chancellorsville was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Yet the Confederate triumph came at a devastating cost. During the confusion of battle, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men. His left arm had to be amputated, and within days he succumbed to pneumonia. His death struck Lee like a thunderbolt. "I have lost my right arm," Lee mourned. Despite the personal and strategic loss, Lee resolved to strike north again, hoping to win a decisive battle on Union soil that would shatter Northern morale and perhaps even force peace negotiations. In June 1863, his army surged across the Potomac River into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, the newly appointed Union commander, General George G. Meade, raced to intercept him. What followed would become the most famous and fateful encounter of the entire war, the Battle of Gettysburg. From July 1 to July 3, 1863, the rolling hills and ridges surrounding the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, became the site of a cataclysmic struggle. On the first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town and occupied strong positions on the surrounding heights. But the Union managed to regroup on Cemetery Hill and Ridge, forming a strong defensive line. The second day saw furious assaults on the Union flanks. At places like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den, the fighting reached fever pitch. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine held the far left of the Union line in a desperate bayonet charge that repelled wave after wave of Confederates. Each hill and hollow was soaked in blood. The final day, July 3, brought Lee's boldest gamble, Pickett's charge. Believing the Union center was vulnerable, Lee ordered 12,000 men under General George Pickett and others to march across open fields into a storm of artillery and rifle fire. It was a devastating miscalculation. The Confederates were cut down by the thousands. The survivors who reached the Union lines were repulsed in savage hand-to-hand combat. The charge failed. Lee's army was broken. Gettysburg was the high-water mark of the Confederacy. Lee's invasion of the North had ended in disaster, and the Army of Northern Virginia would never again mount a major offensive. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing over the course of 3 terrible days, making it the bloodiest battle in American history. As Lee limped back toward Virginia, another drama unfolded far to the west, one that would complement the victory at Gettysburg and shift the war's momentum fully to the Union. In Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant had laid siege to the fortress city of Vicksburg. For months, Grant had maneuvered through swamps and hostile terrain to encircle the city and cut off its supplies. Vicksburg was the key to controlling the Mississippi River, the artery of the Confederacy. Its capture would split the South in two. Beginning in May, Grant launched a series of direct assaults on the city's defenses, but the Confederate fortifications held. He then settled in for a methodical siege, bombarding the city and cutting off all escape or resupply. Inside the walls of Vicksburg, civilians and soldiers alike suffered from starvation. They ate rats and dogs. They dug caves into hillsides to escape the shells. Still, they held on. Finally, on July 4, 1863, one day after Pickett's charge failed at Gettysburg, the Confederate garrison surrendered. The Mississippi River now flowed unimpeded from Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, declared, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a decisive turning point. The South was now on the defensive across all fronts. Its hopes for foreign recognition had evaporated. Its economy, strangled by the blockade and the loss of key territory, began to unravel. Inflation soared, food shortages spread, and desertions from the Confederate Army increased. In the North, the victories brought renewed hope, but also reminded the public of the war's terrible cost. That summer, the first federal conscription law triggered widespread resistance. In New York City, anti-draft riots turned into brutal race-based violence as Irish immigrants, resentful of being drafted to fight a war for emancipation, turned their anger on black citizens. It took federal troops, fresh from Gettysburg, to suppress the riots after days of looting, murder, and fire. Amid this turmoil, Lincoln journeyed to Gettysburg in November 1863 to dedicate a new national cemetery. His address was brief, just over 2 minutes, but it echoed across time. For 47 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. With those words, Lincoln recast the meaning of the war. It was no longer simply a struggle to reunite states, but a profound contest for the very soul of democracy. Chapter 5: Total War and the Road to Atlanta. As 1864 dawned, the American Civil War entered its 4th year. By now, the conflict had evolved far beyond the expectations of either side. What had begun as a political crisis over secession had become a national crucible, one that reshaped the landscape, the government, and the very purpose of the United States. The death toll had surpassed 500,000. The South, battered and bleeding, was still fiercely defiant. The North, weary and politically divided, faced its own internal fractures. Both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis knew that the next year would be decisive. President Lincoln, increasingly reliant on his generals to finish the job, had finally found in Ulysses S. Grant a commander who shared his strategic vision and resolve. In March of 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to the newly created rank of General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant, a man of few words and iron determination, immediately began coordinating a nationwide campaign to strangle the Confederacy from all sides. His plan was simple in concept but staggering in scope. A series of simultaneous offensives to stretch Southern forces to the breaking point. In the East, Grant would personally oversee the Overland Campaign, aimed directly at crushing Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and capturing Richmond. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's trusted protege, would strike into the Deep South and seize the industrial hub of Atlanta, Georgia. Other Union forces would move to tie down Confederate armies in the Shenandoah Valley and push into Alabama and the Gulf states. No longer would the war be confined to battlefields, it would now touch every town, field, and family in the rebellious states. This was the dawn of total war. Grant's Overland Campaign began in May 1864 with the Battle of the Wilderness. The dense Virginia forest erupted into a hellscape of fire, smoke, and confusion. The fighting was so intense that entire woods were set ablaze, incinerating wounded soldiers where they lay. Neither side could claim a clear victory, but unlike his predecessors, Grant did not retreat. He moved forward, southward, always pressing Lee. The campaign continued at Spotsylvania Courthouse and then at Cold Harbor. These were among the bloodiest battles of the war. At Cold Harbor, Grant launched a frontal assault on heavily entrenched Confederate positions. In less than an hour, over 7,000 Union soldiers fell. Grant would later regret the attack, writing, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." Still, Grant did not pull back. Instead, he maneuvered around Lee and laid siege to the city of Petersburg, just south of Richmond. With its network of railroads supplying the Confederate capital, Petersburg was vital. Grant knew that if he could starve Petersburg, Richmond would fall. What followed was a 10-month siege that tested the endurance of both armies and civilians alike. Meanwhile, in the West, Sherman launched his Atlanta campaign. His army of 100,000 men moved methodically through northern Georgia, engaging Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. Sherman's advance was relentless. Johnston, skilled but overly cautious, avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to retreat slowly while building defensive positions. This exasperated Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who replaced him with the aggressive but reckless General John Bell Hood. Hood took a different approach. He launched repeated attacks on Sherman's forces in a bid to halt the Union advance. The results were disastrous. Hood's assaults were repelled with staggering losses, weakening the Confederate Army of Tennessee beyond repair. By September 2, 1864, Sherman's troops entered Atlanta. The capture of this critical transportation and industrial hub sent shockwaves through the Confederacy, and jubilation through the North. The fall of Atlanta also transformed the political landscape. In the North, Lincoln had been facing a difficult re-election campaign. Many in his own party doubted his chances. The Democratic candidate, George B. McClellan, Lincoln's former general, campaigned on a platform of peace negotiations, which could have allowed the Confederacy to survive. But with Sherman's triumph, Northern morale surged. Lincoln's commitment to unconditional victory was validated. In November 1864, he was resoundingly re-elected, winning 212 of 233 electoral votes. Lincoln saw his re-election not as a personal victory, but as a mandate from the people to see the war through to its moral conclusion. "Now we are going to press forward to final victory," he told supporters. His second inaugural address, delivered just months later, would stand as one of the most profound articulations of the war's meaning. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace." Yet the war was far from over. Sherman now embarked on his most controversial and destructive campaign, the March to the Sea. From mid-November to December 1864, Sherman's army cut a swath of devastation from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. They destroyed railroads, burned crops, tore up roads, and dismantled infrastructure, anything that could support the Confederate war effort. Sherman's intent was not just to defeat Southern armies, but to break the will of the Southern people to continue fighting. His campaign ushered in a brutal psychological warfare. Yet he also strictly prohibited attacks on civilians themselves. His march was methodical, not random, designed to cripple the Confederacy's capacity to resist, not to enact vengeance. By December, Sherman reached Savannah and offered the captured city to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The Confederacy, already buckling under military pressure, now faced economic collapse, widespread famine, and social disintegration. In Richmond, desperation took hold. Food riots erupted, and the Confederate dollar became worthless. Desertion rates soared. Southern leaders debated arming enslaved men to fight, an act that would have undermined the very ideology they were fighting to preserve. As 1864 gave way to 1865, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. But the final chapter would still be written in blood. Chapter 6: The Collapse of the Confederacy and the Final Days of War. The early months of 1865 dawned bleak for the Confederacy. It was a nation in its death throes, starving, splintered, and besieged. Railroads lay twisted and useless. Armies dwindled with each passing day, thinned by casualties, desertion, and hunger. Cities once filled with patriotic resolve now seethed with frustration and despair. The Confederate dream was disintegrating, but even in its final hours, it fought with bitter, unrelenting defiance. In the East, Grant's siege of Petersburg had ground on since the summer of 1864. A ring of Union trenches and fortifications now strangled the city, cutting off Confederate supplies and reinforcements. Inside, Lee's army was malnourished and exhausted, their numbers shrinking with every skirmish. But Grant would not relent. He continued tightening the noose, launching probing attacks, severing rail lines, and gradually overwhelming the defenses that shielded Richmond. Meanwhile, in the South, Sherman resumed his campaign. After taking Savannah in December 1864, he turned northward in early 1865, slicing through the Carolinas with the same ruthless efficiency that had marked his march to the sea. South Carolina, the birthplace of secession, received no mercy. Its capital, Columbia, was engulfed in flames, accidental or deliberate, history still debates. Cities were occupied, railroads torn apart, and Confederate resistance scattered like dry leaves in the wind. Sherman's forces encountered little organized opposition. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, returned to command in desperation, could do little to halt the tide. His army, cobbled together from battered remnants, was no match for Sherman's disciplined veterans. With every mile of progress, the Confederacy was cleaved and carved into pieces. Back in Washington, Lincoln worked tirelessly to ensure that the Union victory would be more than just military. He pushed for the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would abolish slavery in all its forms. On January 31, 1865, the amendment passed in Congress. The vote was close, requiring impassioned lobbying and political maneuvering, but its passage marked the formal death knell for the institution that had sparked the war. As spring approached, Lee's position became untenable. On April 1, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan shattered the Confederate right flank at the Battle of Five Forks. The next day, Grant ordered a general assault. The Confederate lines at Petersburg broke. Lee informed Jefferson Davis that he could no longer hold the city. On April 2, Richmond was evacuated. Davis and his cabinet fled, setting fire to stockpiles of military supplies to prevent their capture. Flames spread through the city unchecked. The Confederate capital, once the proud heart of rebellion, was consumed by chaos. Union troops entered Richmond the following day. Among them was Lincoln himself, who arrived to walk its streets, unguarded, solemn, and greeted by newly freed men and women who knelt before him in awe. Lee, meanwhile, retreated westward, hoping to link up with Johnston's forces in North Carolina. But Grant pursued him relentlessly, cutting off supply lines and outmaneuvering the Confederate army at every turn. Lee's men, starving and ragged, fought bravely in rearguard actions, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee saw that further resistance would mean needless slaughter. He met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, in the parlor of a private home owned by Wilmer McLean. There, the two generals, opposites in demeanor but equals in dignity, negotiated the terms of surrender. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms but be allowed to return home with their horses and personal belongings. Officers could keep their sidearms. Grant also ordered that food be provided to Lee's starving troops. There would be no mass arrests, no public humiliations, no executions. The war was to end, not in vengeance, but in reconciliation. As Lee departed, some Union officers saluted him. There were no cheers, only silence. The weight of the moment was too heavy for celebration. Within weeks, the remaining Confederate armies followed Lee's example. General Johnston surrendered to Sherman on April 26 in North Carolina. General Kirby Smith's forces in the Trans-Mississippi Department capitulated in May. The last Confederate general to surrender, Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader, did so on June 23, 1865. But even as peace settled over the ravaged land, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. There, he was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, a fanatical Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln died the next morning. The nation mourned as it had never mourned before. Lincoln, the man who had steered the Union through its darkest storm, did not live to see the healing of the country he had preserved. His funeral train carried his body across the nation, drawing millions of grieving citizens who lined the tracks to pay their final respects. Booth's assassination of Lincoln was not just the death of a man, it was the silencing of a guiding voice of compassion, moderation, and vision. The nation would face reconstruction without the steady hand of the leader who most understood its complexity. Chapter 8: The Legacy of the Civil War. More than a century and a half has passed since the last cannon of the Civil War fell silent, yet the war's shadow continues to stretch across the American landscape. It remains the central conflict in the story of the United States, a war fought not just over land or independence, but over the very meaning of liberty, union, and human dignity. The Civil War resolved two fundamental questions that had haunted the young republic since its inception. First, it confirmed the indivisibility of the Union. The notion that a state could unilaterally secede from the United States was crushed on the battlefield. The war forged a stronger federal government, one that had both the moral and military authority to preserve the nation as a single, indivisible entity. From this point forward, the idea of the United States transformed, from a collection of semi-sovereign states into a unified nation-state. Second, the war abolished slavery, the country's original sin. The Emancipation Proclamation, and later the 13th Amendment, ended the legalized bondage of millions of African Americans. In doing so, the war rewrote the moral fabric of the nation. It was no longer possible to speak of freedom, democracy, and the American dream without confronting the foundational contradiction of slavery. The Civil War made real, for the first time, the possibility that all men are created equal could be more than mere rhetoric. Yet abolition did not bring true freedom. The century following the war was marked by systemic racism, segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. For generations, African Americans in the South lived under the weight of Jim Crow laws that sought to erase the gains of emancipation and Reconstruction. Lynch mobs replaced slave patrols. Poll taxes and literacy tests replaced plantation shackles. The war had ended slavery, but not the racism and inequality upon which it had been built. Still, the legacy of the Civil War served as both a wound and a wellspring. Every movement for justice that followed, women's suffrage, labor rights, civil rights, drew upon the language and principles enshrined in the Reconstruction Amendments. When Martin Luther King Jr. marched across Selma, he marched in the footsteps of those freedmen who had once voted under the protection of Union troops. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she echoed the quiet defiance of those who once fled the whip and the chain. Culturally, the Civil War left an indelible mark on the American imagination. Its stories, of brother against brother, of noble sacrifice and tragic loss, have been retold in countless books, films, songs, and memorials. The figure of Abraham Lincoln became a symbol of wisdom and unity, his words etched into marble and memory. Battlefields such as Gettysburg and Antietam became hallowed ground, visited by millions seeking to understand the price of freedom. Yet the memory of the war has also been contested. For decades, a lost cause narrative prevailed in the South, portraying the Confederacy as a noble struggle for states' rights rather than a rebellion to preserve slavery. Confederate statues were erected, not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but during periods of racial backlash, especially during the rise of Jim Crow and again during the Civil Rights era. These monuments were not neutral artifacts of history, they were declarations of defiance. Today, the United States continues to wrestle with that legacy. Debates over monuments, flags, and historical interpretation are not just academic. They are reflections of the deeper, ongoing struggle over national identity. What does it mean to be American? Whose stories are told, and whose are silenced? Can a nation founded in contradiction find redemption in truth? The Civil War taught the nation painful lessons, many of which remain incomplete. It showed that democracy is not inevitable, it must be fought for, often at terrible cost. It revealed the destructive power of division and the high price of hatred. And it proved that even in the face of unimaginable loss, a nation could choose a path of rebirth. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies in the unfinished work it left behind. In his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln challenged the living to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That challenge endures. The Civil War ended on the battlefield, but the battle for justice, equality, and a more perfect union continues. A nation still becoming. The Civil War was not the end of America's story, it was a crucible in which the nation's soul was tested and tempered. It laid bare the fragility of the Republic, but also its resilience. In the ashes of destruction, it planted the seeds of a new vision, a union where freedom could be expanded, where citizenship might one day mean dignity for all. The cost was staggering. Over 500,000 lives, entire cities destroyed, families shattered, generations traumatized. And yet, from this suffering emerged a renewed America, wounded but wiser, bloodied but unbroken. To study the Civil War is to confront the deepest truths of the American experience. It is to acknowledge that progress often comes in conflict, and that the arc of history, while long, must be bent by the hands of the determined. We live today in the shadow of that great conflict. And in its memory lies a warning, a lesson, and a hope, that liberty must be protected, that unity must be chosen, and that the struggle for a just society is never truly over. So let us remember, not merely to honor the fallen, but to understand ourselves. For the Civil War was not just the story of what happened then. It is the story of who we still are.